Hello, this is Demetria Miles-McDonald, founder and CEO of Decide Diversity and the creator of the Table of Diversity. The question that I'm going to answer today, how did I create the Table of Diversity? This is something that I don't talk about often, but I love talking about because it goes into kind of one of the things that I'm really intentional about, and that's the science of DEI. So back in 2015, I was in the midst of a PhD program where I focused on industrial and organizational psychology with a focus in diversity and inclusion. And I was doing a lot of research, as you can imagine, being part of a PhD program around how do people work? That's what industrial and organizational psychology is. It's the science of people at work. And my focus was on the diversity and inclusion piece. So I'm thinking about how do different groups of people work? And so that includes, looking at anthropology, that's sociology. Of course, it's industrial and organizational psychology. So all of these different fields of study. And so that was a huge foundation for creating the Table of Diversity, because I was able to draw from so many areas of discipline and not just from current research, but I was looking at research from back in the 70s to see how did we get to where we are today. Perhaps what it might have been called in the 70s, it really wasn't diversity, equity, and inclusion then. It might have just been good people practices back then. How did it come to be what it is today? The language that we use, the theories that we are drawing from, all of those things are really important to me and really interesting to me. So I utilized all of that knowledge as a foundation for the Table of Diversity. I also wanted this tool to be something that organizations could utilize and tie data to. So I looked at a couple of things, one being the US Census. I wanted to understand, how does the government look at different aspects of diversity? How does the government classify different demographics? So the US Census is really a very official process, and a lot of how companies and organizations classify people is rooted in how the government does so for a variety of reasons. So that was another place that I looked. The US Census, of course, does not go far enough in how people identify. There have not been a whole lot of changes in how the US Census classifies people based on demographics in a very long time, although fingers crossed there's some changes that are coming. And so I couldn't rely on that 100%. So the next place that I looked was applicant tracking systems, because my primary audience was, of course, people in corporations. So how do human resource professionals, people who are utilizing talent development managers, utilizing these applicant tracking systems, what's the information that they are feeding into the applicant tracking system? But then also, organizations have to report to the EEOC certain demographics. So what are they collecting? What are they storing? And what are they reporting? And so I looked at all of those different things. And once again, it was limited. There just wasn't a whole lot of depth when it came to how people were being classified from an identity perspective. And so I wanted to go a little bit further, which brought me back to, the research that I was doing, and, expanding that beyond the industrial and organizational psychology to look at sociology, to look at anthropology. And those two disciplines were just very helpful when it came to expanding my viewpoints on diversity. And then I checked in with some what I call special interest groups. So oftentimes the research that I was looking at, let's say they were researching women. Well, you'd look at the authors of the research and it'd be all men. And it's like, well, okay, this is helpful to an extent, but I need to hear from women about the experience of women. Like, I'm not trying to hear from a bunch of men about the experience of women. It's a good start, but I need more. And that's what I was finding with a lot of the research. I would go and look at the authors, the researchers, and they would not be of the demographic that they were researching. So I wanted to go to these special interest groups that were composed of people from the community, who could give me better insight on how do you want to be referred to? Like think about your identity. What do we call that? What do we call it in a way that is inclusive, that is truly representative of who you are? And then how can I reflect that on the table of diversity? And as you know, language changes over time. And so it hasn't always been the same, which is I'll talk about that here shortly. But I utilized all of this research, all of this data and I eventually I had to just stop because I was going down so many rabbit holes and trying to figure out what's included on the table of diversity and what's not. And at some points, especially in the beginning, I used a lot of umbrella terms. So like I would use the term genderqueer because if you use that term, it covers a lot of other terms and aspects of identity. And as I got further into it, I realized that there's a better way to utilize language and what needs to be included and what does not. And I'll give you an example. I was doing some research on gender identity, and I know this is not the most scientifically valid place, but when you sign up for an account on Facebook, at least it used to be, you selected your gender identity. And there were like 200 plus options for gender identity. And I was like, whoa, like, how in the world am I going to narrow this down so that folks can find themselves on the table of diversity? And that's when I realized that there was just no easy way to capture everything on the table of diversity. Like I had to have in my mind and on the table of diversity a way to capture things that I just can't fit on the table of diversity. So that's when I created two options. At the bottom of each column on the table of diversity, there's an element that starts with O, and that stands for other. That's not the best way to capture other identities that are not on the table of diversity because I don't want to other anyone. So I started telling people, create your own. Like if you don't see an aspect of your identity on the table of diversity, first tell me because I want to know, because in the next edition, it might be on there. But if there's a valid, scientifically valid reason why it's not on there, or the reason of it just won't fit, then I want to be able to share that so that folks, don't feel left out. But also create your own. And I've found that in doing activities and having conversations and discussions with the table of diversity, when folks create their own element and add that to their diversity formula, the conversations are so rich. The insights that we have because this person says, this part of my identity is so important to me that it needs to be on here. And we have some just really great conversations about that aspect of identity. And sometimes it does go on the table of diversity and sometimes it doesn't. But that has been a great way to ensure that, folks can see themselves on the table of diversity. And there have been some organizations that I've worked with that they've created, we've partnered together to create their own table of diversity that's very specific either to their industry or to their organization, or, just to their particular culture. And so that has been a really interesting and eye-opening experience, is to have the table of diversity translated into different organizations and industries and cultures. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So that's the story of how I created the table of diversity and all the science that went into it. And I probably don't talk about that enough because, folks see the table of diversity and they're like, oh, this is really cool. But there's science behind it. There was a lot of research that was done, and that still happens because, as you know, language changes and how people refer to themselves changes over time. and the table of diversity has to keep up with that. And so there's still a lot of learning that I do, that my team does, to ensure that the table of diversity is the most up-to-date, that it's relevant, that it not only captures the language of today, but pushes us to rethink some of the language that we're using so that we can be even more inclusive. So to get your copy of the Table of Diversity, go to tableofdiversity.com. It's completely free. Get your free copy and then come back here, join me on this channel so that we can continue breaking down the Table of Diversity. I can continue telling you about all the behind scenes things that either you may not have known or I might not have told you yet. My name, again, is Demetria Miles-McDonald. I'm the founder and CEO of Decide Diversity and the creator of the Table of Diversity. Come back here, join me soon, and I'll see you then. Bye.